The livestock truck arrived on the hottest afternoon of July. Dust rolled across the Hale farm as the driver opened the trailer doors. 67 sheep stepped onto the pasture. They looked different immediately. Smaller than the commercial wool breeds everyone knew. Compact, powerfully built. Thick double coats despite the summer heat. Curved horns crowned several of the rams. Others carried calm, alert expressions as they spread across the grass. Nathan leaned against the fence. They certainly don't look like ordinary sheep. Margaret smiled. They aren't. The driver laughed. I've delivered Icelandic sheep for 15 years. He watched the flock begin grazing. I've never had anyone buy this many at once. Margaret looked over the animals. They've got work to do. The driver scratched his beard. You planning to sell breeding stock? No. Specialty wool? No. He looked puzzled. What then? Margaret smiled. I think they're going to teach us something. The Hale farm had always raised sheep. Mostly commercial breeds selected for fast lamb growth. They performed well. Until winter. Every year the same problems appeared. Windbreaks needed repairs. Extra bedding. Frozen water. Heavy grain feeding. Winter losses weren't devastating. But they were expensive. Samuel Hale had noticed that decades earlier. When Margaret was 15, he handed her an old agricultural journal. Inside was an article about Icelandic sheep surviving Arctic winters. She laughed. We don't live in Iceland. Samuel smiled. No. Silence. But weather doesn't ask permission. She studied photographs of thick-coated sheep standing comfortably in deep snow. They're built differently. They've had 1,000 years to become that way. Margaret never forgot those pictures. Years later, while attending a regional livestock conference, she wandered into a small booth displaying heritage sheep breeds. Most visitors walked past. Margaret stopped. An elderly breeder greeted her. You know what these are? Icelandic sheep. He smiled. Most people don't. They spent nearly 2 hours talking. The breeder explained their history. Naturally insulating double fleece. Strong maternal instincts. Excellent foraging ability. Remarkable resistance to cold. Easy lambing. Long productive lives. Margaret listened carefully. She asked questions nobody else seemed interested in. Winter feed efficiency. Hoof health. Browsing habits. Shelter requirements. By the end of the conversation, she carried home far more than brochures. She carried curiosity. 2 years later, she found herself unloading 67 Icelandic sheep onto the Hale farm. The county heard about them within days. Naturally. Saturday morning found the coffee shop crowded. Dale Harper folded his newspaper. You hear what Margaret bought? Rick looked up. What now? Some fancy sheep from Iceland. Several ranchers laughed. Iceland. Dale nodded. As if our winters are anything like theirs. Another farmer grinned. Maybe she thinks they're polar bears. More laughter echoed through the room. Margaret walked inside carrying mineral blocks. Dale waved. Morning. Morning. He smiled. So. She laughed. So. How are the Viking sheep? They're eating. More laughter. You planning to teach them to pull sleds? Margaret smiled. No. What then? I don't know yet. That answer sounded familiar. She truly didn't know exactly where the opportunity would lead. She simply knew animals, shaped by centuries of difficult winters, deserved a closer look. Back home, Margaret refused to manage them exactly like her old flock. Instead, she observed. The Icelandic sheep browsed far more than they grazed. They eagerly ate brush. Wild blackberry vines. Young cedar sprouts. Multiflora rose. Plants other sheep ignored. Nathan watched them strip leaves from low shrubs. I've never seen sheep eat like goats. Margaret smiled. Neither had Grandpa. She opened another of Samuel's notebooks. Inside rested only a few handwritten pages. Decades earlier, Samuel had experimented with 4 Icelandic ewes borrowed from another breeder. The trial lasted only 1 winter before the breeder reclaimed them. Yet Samuel filled page after page with observations. Browses before grazing. Needs less grain. Never stood facing away from the wind. Remarkably alert during storms. Margaret smiled. Grandpa had noticed everything. The extension livestock specialist visited in early autumn. He slowly walked through the pasture. The flock moved quietly together. Every sheep looked healthy, strong, athletic. He stopped beside one mature ewe. Beautiful animals. Margaret nodded. They're settling in. He examined the dense fleece. I've honestly never worked with many Icelandics. She smiled. Neither have most people. The specialist admitted something surprising. I've always wanted to see how they'd perform here. Margaret laughed. So have I. Autumn arrived gently. The flock needed remarkably little supplemental feed. Instead of standing near hay feeders, they wandered through brushy hillsides cleaning invasive plants. Nathan looked across the pasture one evening. They're saving us hours with a brush cutter. Margaret nodded. They seemed to enjoy it. The county conservation technician stopped unexpectedly. He watched the sheep browsing cedar saplings. I've usually seen goats do this. Margaret smiled. They're surprisingly versatile. By November, the first snow arrived. Nothing unusual. Only a few inches. Neighboring flocks crowded tightly inside barns. Margaret opened the shelter. The Icelandic sheep walked outside instead. Nathan laughed. They're choosing snow. They prefer cool weather. The sheep grazed calmly while snowflakes collected across their thick wool. They seemed completely unconcerned. Several lambs even played across frozen pasture. The veterinarian visited the following week. He watched quietly, then smiled. I don't think they're aware it's cold. Margaret laughed. They probably think it's pleasant. Winter deepened. Temperatures dropped steadily. The flock continued thriving. Feed consumption remained noticeably lower than previous years. Margaret checked the storage barn twice, then called Nathan. Come look. He counted the hay bales. That's impossible. No. She smiled. They're simply eating less. Samuel's old records hinted the same thing decades earlier. Dense double fleece reduced maintenance energy. The sheep converted forage efficiently. They wasted remarkably little feed. Every observation seemed to repeat itself. Then December arrived. Weather forecasts began changing. Meteorologists spoke cautiously at first, then more confidently. An Arctic air mass unlike anything seen in decades had formed across northern Canada. Cold, persistent, powerful. The local television station interrupted programming. One forecast predicted the coldest winter in 30 years. Neighboring ranchers hurried to purchase extra hay, extra bedding, portable heaters, tank warmers. Margaret bought almost nothing. Dale Harper noticed at the feed store. No extra hay? Margaret shook her head. We're ready. He frowned. For this winter? She nodded. I think so. Dale looked unconvinced. I hope those Icelandic sheep know something the rest of us don't. The first blizzard struck 3 days before Christmas. Wind screamed across the valley. Temperatures plunged below zero. Snow drifted against barns. Roads disappeared. Power failed throughout the county. Nathan fought through waist-deep drifts to reach the sheep pasture before sunrise. He expected panic. Instead, the flock stood calmly together behind a natural cedar windbreak. Snow rested across their backs like blankets. Several ewes quietly pawed through drifts searching for forage. Not one appeared distressed. Nathan hurried back toward the house. Margaret met him on the porch. How bad? He looked genuinely amazed. They're acting like it's October. The blizzard lasted another 2 days. Then another Arctic front followed. By New Year's Day, the county had recorded temperatures colder than anyone under 40 remembered experiencing. The extension livestock specialist drove onto the hail farm as soon as roads reopened. He climbed out wearing 3 heavy coats. He stared silently across the pasture. 67 Icelandic sheep grazed calmly through fresh snow beneath a pale winter sun. He lowered his binoculars, then looked toward Margaret. I've got a question. She smiled. Go ahead. He pointed toward the flock. Exactly how much grain have you had to add since this cold wave started? The extension livestock specialist lowered his binoculars. He looked back toward Margaret. Exactly how much grain have you had to add since this cold wave started? Margaret answered honestly. About 30% less than last winter. Nathan handed him another of Samuel Hale's weathered notebooks. The specialist flipped through page after page. Daily feed records. Hay consumption. Body condition scores. Lambing percentages. Weather observations. Everything had been measured. Finally, he looked up. You've tracked every winter. Margaret nodded. My grandfather believed weather only teaches people who write things down. The specialist smiled. I wish every producer kept records like these. He spent another hour observing the flock. The Icelandic sheep moved calmly across the snow. Instead of crowding tightly around hay feeders, they spread out, pawing through shallow drifts to reach dormant grasses and browse. Their thick outer coats shed blowing snow like waterproof jackets. The soft inner fleece trapped warm air against their bodies. The specialist quietly shook his head. They're wasting remarkably little energy. Nathan looked curious. What do you mean? They aren't fighting winter. He pointed toward the flock. They were built for it. The cold deepened. Night after night temperatures plunged lower. Water lines froze across the county. Barn roofs groaned beneath heavy snow. Emergency livestock shelters filled with exhausted producers trying to protect vulnerable animals. Margaret checked her flock every few hours. Not because they seemed distressed. Because she wanted to learn. The sheep surprised her every day. Rather than huddling inside the open shelter, most chose natural cedar windbreaks. Ewes dug shallow resting places into the snow. The rams stood facing directly into the wind, protecting younger animals behind them. No panic, no crowding, no unnecessary movement. Samuel had written about exactly that. The flock organizes itself before the shepherd notices the storm. Margaret smiled every time she saw it happen. One afternoon, Dale Harper drove onto the farm. His pickup carried several empty feed sacks. He climbed out looking tired. "You got a minute?" "Of course." He looked across the pasture. "I've already gone through almost half my emergency hay." Margaret nodded quietly. "My sheep are eating nearly twice what they normally do." She understood. Most commercial breeds required significantly more energy simply to maintain body temperature during prolonged cold. Dale watched the Icelandic flock browsing cedar tips along the fence line. "They're still eating brush. They enjoy it." He laughed softly. "I thought they'd freeze first." Margaret smiled. "They probably think this is comfortable." Dale looked down at the snow. "I laughed." "You did. I guess I didn't understand what they were built for." That week, the county veterinarian began visiting sheep farms throughout the region. Cases of frostbite appeared. Respiratory illness increased. Several flocks experienced difficult lambing because of prolonged stress. When he reached the Hale farm, he spent nearly 2 hours examining the Icelandic sheep. Healthy lungs, strong body condition, clean feet, bright eyes. Even heavily pregnant ewes remained calm. Finally, he looked at Margaret. "I've got a question." She smiled. "Go ahead. When do these ewes usually lamb?" "Late winter." He looked surprised. "You aren't moving them into heated barns?" She shook her head. "No." He studied the flock again. "I think they'll manage." Late February brought the biggest storm of the season. Nearly 3 feet of snow buried the valley. Roads closed completely. Power failed again. Temperatures remained below zero for nearly a week. Neighboring farms struggled to reach livestock. Some sheep refused to leave crowded barns. Others developed pneumonia from poor ventilation. Margaret fought through the drifts at first light. She expected trouble. Instead, she found newborn lambs. 2 tiny lambs stood beside their mother beneath a dense cedar windbreak. Their fickle had already begun drying. Both nursed vigorously despite the bitter cold. Margaret couldn't help smiling. Nathan arrived minutes later. "They lambed." She nodded. During the storm, he stared in disbelief. "They look perfect." The veterinarian returned as soon as roads reopened. He examined the lambs carefully. Healthy, strong, alert. He looked at Margaret. "I've honestly never seen lambs this vigorous after weather like this." News spread quickly. The county newspaper published a front-page photograph of the newborn lambs standing in fresh snow beside their Icelandic ewe. The headline read, "Heritage sheep thrive through historic blizzard." Suddenly, everyone wanted to see the flock. University livestock researchers visited. Extension specialists returned. Even commercial sheep producers from neighboring counties drove hours to study the animals. One researcher asked, "What special shelter are you using?" Margaret smiled. "The cedar trees." Another asked, "Special winter ration?" "No." "Extra heating?" She laughed. "We don't have any." The researchers exchanged surprised looks. They realized something important. The sheep weren't surviving because of expensive management. They were surviving because generations of careful breeding had prepared them for exactly these conditions. Spring finally arrived. Snow melted slowly. Pastures began turning green. The county livestock office completed its winter survey. Feed costs had climbed dramatically for most sheep operations. Winter losses had been the highest in decades. The Hale farm stood apart. Lower feed costs. Excellent lamb survival. Outstanding body condition. The extension specialist presented the findings at the annual sheep producers meeting. He displayed charts comparing winter performance. Then he showed a photograph of Margaret's flock grazing comfortably during the coldest week of the year. One producer raised his hand. "So should everyone switch to Icelandic sheep?" Margaret shook her head before the specialist could answer. "No." The room became quiet. She continued, "They fit our farm." She looked around the room. "Every farm is different." Another producer asked, "So what's the lesson?" Margaret smiled. "The lesson isn't Icelandic sheep." Silence. It's matching your livestock to your environment instead of forcing the environment to match your livestock. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Then heads began nodding. Dale Harper stood afterward. "I've got something to admit." Everyone looked toward him. "I laughed when Margaret unloaded those sheep." He smiled. "I thought they were expensive decorations." Laughter filled the room. Dale continued, "I spent years trying to make ordinary sheep survive extraordinary winters." He looked toward Margaret. She bought sheep that already knew how. That autumn waiting lists formed for Icelandic breeding stock across the region. Margaret sold only a few animals, carefully selected. She refused to expand too quickly. Samuel had warned against that as well. Good genetics grow slowly. Bad decisions grow fast. One quiet evening, Margaret walked through the pasture as the first snowflakes of another winter drifted from the sky. The flock grazed peacefully beneath the fading light. Young lambs from the previous storm had grown into strong yearlings. They carried the same calm confidence as the older sheep. She remembered the laughter at the coffee shop, the jokes about polar bears, the comments about Viking sheep. Nobody laughed anymore. Now they asked questions. Years earlier, the county saw 67 unusual sheep arriving from a distant island and assumed Margaret had purchased an expensive curiosity. They saw thick wool, curved horns, small bodies, an uncommon breed. Margaret saw more than 1,000 years of natural selection solving problems no machine, Peter, or extra bale of hay could solve as efficiently. She never expected the coldest winter in 30 years. She never hoped neighboring flocks would struggle. She simply believed that animals shaped by harsh environments carried valuable lessons worth preserving. By the time spring sunlight melted the last snowdrifts from the Hale farm, the Icelandic sheep had done far more than survive. They had reminded an entire farming community that resilience isn't built when the storm arrives. It's quietly bred, chosen, and prepared for long before the first snowflake ever falls.